Hello everyone, here comes the most unpredictable part of the story. You're going to have a great time, it's absolutely incredible. Alright, let's watch it. White starts with e4. The player with the black pieces replies with e5. Knight to f3, knight to c6, so far it's standard, and now bishop to c4. Now black can play bishop to c5, which is called the Italian game. But in this game, black prefers to play knight to f6. This is what's called the two knights defense. So the two knights defense allows for an attacking move, which is knight to g5. And knight to g5, it's not easy for less experienced players to defend against the attack on the pawn at f7. In reality, the main move is the push d5 to block the bishop's diagonal, attacking the pawn on ef7. But here, black plays bishop to c5. He ignores the attack on the pawn at f7 to counterattack the pawn on f2. This is what's called the Traxler counterattack. And this counterattack actually leads to completely wild games. It was invented by a priest. His name is Karol Traxler. And I made a video about the first time this priest played this counterattack. And it was a magnificent game, maybe the most beautiful one on my YouTube channel. So in this game, after bishop to c5, well, you can capture the f7 pawn in several ways. You can take with the bishop to check the king. That's probably the safest way, by the way, to play against the Traxler counterattack. But obviously, when you have the knight on g5, you want to take the pawn on f7 and fork the queen and rook. And that's exactly what the player with the white pieces did. So, what is the idea behind the Traxler counterattack? Why would you allow such a fork to happen? Well, there's the bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes f2, check. And here the safest move is to step aside to f1 and above all, not to touch the bishop. In the game, the bishop was captured. So, what did black have planned? Because after all, they've just given up a piece, the bishop on f2. And they're still facing the fork, with the queen and rook under attack. Black captures on e4. They're trying to draw out the king. The idea is often to bring the queen out to h4 afterwards, so the queen and knight can work together to attack the king, and even to prepare a short castle. Because if the black king castle's short, the rook will be on f8. And often it pins the knight, which won't be able to move because of the indirect attack on the white king. In the game, the king came to e3, so the main move here is queen to h4. But the player with the black pieces plays queen to e7. So here, with white, you can go and take the rook, but there is still some attack. For example, if white takes the rook, which is not what happened in the game, but then we have queen to g5 check, attacking the king, and after king takes... The best is to play queen to f4 check, for example, king to d3, followed by the pawn push d5. This pawn push is very common in the Traxler counterattack, giving up the pawn on d5 to quickly bring the bishop out for the attack. And it's very dangerous for white. In the game, the knight did not go to take the rook. White played c3. They want to control the d4 square to prevent, for example, the knight from coming in to join the attack as well. And they free up the c2 square, which could allow escape routes for the king. And here, the best move for black, which wasn't played in the game, is again this d5 push to free the bishop. In the game, black played knight to d4. It's a very impressive move, this knight to d4, because the knight comes to the square where the pawn... It's placed on c3 to be able to contest it, to be able to take the knight. So it's very surprising that black plays knight to d4. And we're going to look at this move since it's the move played in the game. But I want to go back to the best move, d5. Why? Because in some variations it can end with mate, either from the h7 pawn or the g7 pawn. And that's actually pretty funny. So let's take a look. The best move for black in this position would have been to play the pawn to d5. For example, bishop takes d5, queen to c5 check. King takes knight, and since we freed the bishop with this d5 push, we can play bishop to f5 check. We sacrifice again, but the king is more and more exposed from his position, so we get revenge with queen takes d5. And for example, after knight takes rook, we have knight to e7 check, and we're going to coordinate with the knight, the central pawn, the queen, and the g7 and h7 pawns, which will eventually deliver checkmate. Because after all, the entire white army is on the first rank, except for the knight, which is on the last rank, but there is no development for white. For example, king to g4, queen takes g2, check. Then if king to h4, we have knight to f5, check, king to h5. And we have this mate with the g6 pawn. Well, not immediately, the knight can sacrifice itself, but we recapture with the pawn and we have this mate. A beautiful collaboration, by the way. The queen defends the pawn attacks, the knight traps, the queen also controls the g4 and g5 squares. A lovely mate. And when the queen takes on g2, we saw that if the king goes to h4, the knight comes to f5, and if the king goes to h5, we would have queen to h3, check. It forces the king to come to g5, and this time it's not mate with the g7 pawn, but mate with the h7 pawn coming to h6, a beautiful mate as well. But as I mentioned, in the actual game, it wasn't the d5 push that happened, it was the move knight to d4. What do we do here? It's incredible, both knights are left en prise. You can take the knight on e4 and the knight on d4. You can also take the rook on h8. In reality, according to the computer, the best move is to take none of these pieces and to play pawn to d3. This attacks both knights as well as the rook, but you have to play this pawn move to d3. And we'll see that all the captures fail. For example, if the knight takes the rook here, we can go back to the move queen to g5 check with the d5 pawn push and the bishop getting involved. For example, queen to g5 check, the king takes the knight, d5 push with check, bishop takes, and bishop to f5 check. And the king has no squares except to take the pawn on a5. And if the king takes on a5, he's facing the queen, so we can play bishop to c2 check with the queen attacking and the bishop attacking the white queen. So, as a result, we understand that taking the rook, it's very dangerous for the safety of the white king, but taking both knights is also dangerous. If we take the knight on d4 in the game, he took the knight on e4, but let's see what happens if we take the knight on d4, then the e-pawn recaptures, and the idea is to prepare an attack on the king because it opens the e-file with the queen and king facing each other. If the king takes on d4, we could have the move c5. If the king comes to d5, knight to f6 is checkmate. We're going to see a lot of checkmates in this game. And if the king comes to d3, there's the fork with knight to f2, attacking both the king and the queen. So as white, we understand that we can't touch the d4 pawn, but if we go to d3, there's still that fork on ef2. If we go to e2, there's knight to c3 again with the fork, because it's a double check. The knight attacks the king, but also the queen. And if the king comes to f3, we still have this idea of pushing d5 to free the bishop, for example. Bishop takes d5. And here we can castle short. I mentioned this move to you before, castling short with the rook coming to pin the knight. But we can also have ideas like bishop to g4, check with a skewer, attacking the king and the queen, and if the king takes the bishop, that once again allows for a fork. So we've understood in this position that taking the rook on h8 is very dangerous for the king. Taking the knight is also very dangerous for the king, with the pawn recapture and the opening of the e-file. So in the game, well, the player took the knight on e4. d5 is still the right move, as we've seen in many variations, right? It's a truly thematic move in this Traxler counterattack, but it's queen to h4 that the player with black played. The king moved to e3, queen to f4 check, and he goes to d3. And this time, black is considering the move d5. So bishop takes. And we know that this move d5 is always played to free up the c8 bishop with tempo, allowing it to come to f5. And when the bishop comes to f5, not only does it attack the king, of course, with check, but it also creates ideas of castling queenside, thus bringing the a8 rook into the fight, where it becomes centralized. So the king has no squares here except to move to c4, and we continue the attack with d5 check. In the game, the king went to c5. Now one might wonder, why is he being drawn into black's camp? He could go to b4. But on b4, he gets hit with a 5 check, and the game could even end with a checkmate by a pawn. We had seen checkmates with the h7 and g7 pawns, and here it could be a checkmate with the a5 pawn, or rather the pawn on the a file. Look, after king to a3, we can play b4 with a decisive attack. It could even open the file for the rook, but we can also play knight to c2 check. If the capture happens, we can win the queen or always play the move d4, which is always a very strong move. But after king to b3, we have this move a4, checkmate with the a pawn. I think we could also checkmate with the queen on a4, but it's prettier to checkmate with the pawn. So as we've seen, after king to b4, there's this pawn push to a5. So the king comes to c5. And here, even though white has a material advantage, they have 2 extra pieces. After all, black hasn't captured anything yet. Still, the position of the white king is questionable because it's in black's territory and therefore in great danger. And black is going to play a very good move here. They're going to play queen to h4. Not easy to think of, but this move, queen to h4, aims to come to e7. For example, white still can't take the rook, otherwise queen to e7 is checkmate. And white can't take the knight either, otherwise the queen will take on d4 with a deadly attack against the king. For example, pawn takes, queen takes d4 check, king to b5, that opens the b file so the rook can get involved in the fight. And here we'll manage to checkmate with the cooperation of the rook and the queen. For example, king to a5, queen to b4 check, king to a6, and queen to b6 mate. So white can't take the rook on h8, they can't take the knight on d4, and black is threatening to bring the queen to e7. So what did white play? Well, they went back and took on e5. Why this capture on e5? It's important for white to take the pawn on e5 because after queen to e7 check, the king could take the knight, whereas if the pawn on e5 was still there, that wouldn't be possible. Now black castles queenside. We can see they want to involve both their rooks in the attack. The rook on d8 now threatens to take the bishop with the arrival of the other rook. I know it's white's turn to move, but I'm showing you the threat. It would be to play rook takes d5 check, so the king takes. Then the other rook comes in, so king to c5. And here queen to e7, checkmate. The rook protects the knight protects the pawn controls the squares, the knight also controls the c6 square. It's a beautiful mate. So we've understood that black's threat is to capture the bishop on d5. So white plays c4 to try to reinforce the bishop's position to be able to recapture with the c4 pawn, and black is still going to sacrifice the rook on d5, rook takes d5. Well played. Pawn takes d5. They bring the other rook to d8, still with the threat of capturing on d5. So white develops to c3, so that the knight protects the pawn on d5. And now black is going to play another incredible move, totally destabilizing. They play knight to c6. Unbelievable. The knight is attacked by all the white pieces, the king, the pawn, and the white knight. We're as hesitant as a mustachioed man in front of a bowl of vermicelli soup. What are we going to do? How are we going to capture? So first, let's look at the simplest variations. If the knight takes the knight on c6, it gives up the defense of the c4 square because the knight on e5 was defending c4, and that would allow the queen to come in and deliver checkmate. The pawn protects the queen, and there's no square for the white king. So we've understood that the knight can't capture. If now the king captures, then the black queen will come to b4, threatening rook to d6 checkmate. And if the knight takes on b5 to control the d6 square, we can simply play a6. We attack the knight, and we're even threatening queen takes knight mate. And if the knight moves, we'll have rook to d6 mate. So it's true that the knight could come and give check, but we go to b8 and it doesn't change the mate threats. Still rook to d6 or queen to b6 mate. So we've seen that knight takes c6 doesn't work because of queen to c4 mate. That king takes c6 doesn't work because of the queen coming to b4, threatening rook to d6 mate. So let's see what happens with pawn takes. Well, that opens the d file. It allows the queen to come to d4 and work together with the rook. So king takes b5, queen to b6 check, king to a4, the rook comes to d4. What do you want to do? If you put the knight, the rook takes and we'll end up mating on b4. Knight to c4, rook takes, king to a3, and queen to b4 is mate. So you see this move knight to c6. White can't capture with the knight, the king, or the pawn. And the problem is, if white doesn't take, black threatens to come in on d4 or b4, supported by the knight, to work together and deliver mate. For example, queen to b4 check, and if the king takes the knight, rook to d6 is mate. We've seen a mate like this. And if white plays a3 to deny the black queen the b4 square, well, she'll come in on d4. And after king takes c6, there's even immediate mate with queen to b6. So, what should white do? You can't capture the knight with the king, the pawn, or even with the knight. And black is threatening to come in on d4 and b4, with a mating attack each time. What should white do? Well, I invite you to please pause the video right here and try to carefully find the most optimal move that will best and most effectively reduce the significant mating threats. A very difficult move to find. And this is where things get spectacular. What did you think of? The best move in the game would have been to play queen to g4. That's not what the player actually played though. He played another completely crazy move. He played queen to a4. But let's look at the move queen to g4. The idea is simple. It's to prevent the black queen from accessing the d4 and b4 squares. If black takes the queen, then this time white can play knight takes c6. And sure, they've lost the queen, but they have two knights and a rook to make up for the loss of the queen. It's difficult for black to mount a checkmating attack against the white king in this position. So to avoid checkmating attacks, you have to sacrifice the queen, accept losing the queen, but take revenge by capturing the knight on c6 and remind yourself that in exchange for the queen, you have a lot of pieces, two knights and an extra rook. So in the game, the player had this idea to sacrifice the queen and prevent the black queen from accessing the d4 and b4 squares. He played queen to a4 with the same idea, which is that if the pawn takes the queen, the knight can capture on c6. The problem with queen to a4 is that black will continue the attack with queen to e7 check. Now you might say that after queen to g4, black could also continue the attack with queen to e7 check, but the bishop wouldn't be able to join the attack because of the pin, and there's still the possibility of capturing the bishop. So at some point the bishop would probably be forced to take the queen and wouldn't be able to join the attack against the white king. So queen to g4 offers more chances to escape than queen to a4. So queen to a4 was played. Black doesn't capture, they play queen to e7 check. If the king takes the knight, black could capture the queen and attack the knight on e5. And if the knight on e5 moves away, thinking that, after all, in this position, white still has both knights and the rook, that's when you see that queen to g4 was better for white, because now the bishop on f5 can come to d7 and deliver mate. And you can see that queen to d7 would not deliver mate because the king could move to c5. So it's indeed bishop to d7 that must be played. That's why in the game the king doesn't take the knight. Instead he takes the pawn on b5. And here black makes a mistake. They should have captured the white knight with their own knight on e5. But they took with the queen to attack the d5 pawn twice, and above all, to pin it. If the king takes the knight, we still have the bishop's involvement, you see. We can play queen to d6 check, king to b5, and then this move, bishop to d3. You see that as long as the bishop has freedom, we can work together to try to checkmate. Now, it's not checkmate yet, the queen can come to c4, but we understand that the attack is decisive. So after this move, queen to e5, white plays queen to c4, protecting d5 and attacking the knight on c6. The knight on c6 moves to d4 to give check, king to a4, bishop to d7, again with check. The king moves to a5. If it goes to a3, black could play knight to c2 check. If king goes to b3, the knight can capture the rook with check. So the king prefers to go to a5. Knight to c6 check, taking advantage of the pin on the d5 pawn, king to a6, knight to b8 check. And now, should you take the pawn on a7 or retreat to a5? In the game, the king took on a7, much to our delight, because you're about to see even more incredible positions and some major twists. But it would have been better to go back to a5. In that case, black could have played knight to c6 check again, exploiting the pin, and it could have led to a draw. But king takes a7 was played. Black played c6 to free up the c7 square for their queen and look for a checkmate. Queen to c7 check, the king would have to go to a8, and then queen to b7 is mate. Actually, the best move was queen to d6, threatening queen to b6 mate. And if white tries to control that b6 square, for example with their queen, there could be queen to a6 mate. The position is completely lost for white. But in the game, c6 was played. After all, it's quite a threat, this move to c7. So white will play knight to b5, taking advantage of the pin on the c6 pawn and controlling the c7 square. There are a lot of pins, you know. We've seen a lot of mates, but there are also a lot of pins in this game to prevent the queen from coming to c7. Black plays bishop to f5. They free up the d7 square for their own rook. But we can also look at what would have happened if the queen had captured on d5. Well, in that case, white exchanges. They can also play king to b6, threatening knight to a7 mate, and knight to d6 checkmate. But black can simply capture the knight to avoid mate. But then white recaptures, and it's completely winning for white. They have an extra rook and additional pawns. That's why, in this position, black won't take the d5 pawn and look for a queen exchange. They prefer to play bishop to f5 and free up the d7 square for their rook. White plays d4, attacking the black queen, rook to d7 check, king to a8, queen to e7, pawn takes c6. They attack the rook and the knight covers the a7 square, so there's no mate. But bishop to e4, pinning on c6. They're also threatening bishop takes c6. White plays d5, bishop takes d5. The pawn on c6 is still pinned, and they're threatening bishop takes c6 with the help of the knight. So what did white have planned? Because here, it seems completely hopeless for the king who wandered all the way to a8. This position is incredible. So what would you play as white? How do you save yourself? How do you get out of trouble in this position? Well, once again, I invite you to pause the video. So what did you come up with? Well, here, there's no choice. You have to sacrifice the queen. Queen takes bishop. So everything is effectively recaptured. Knight to a7, delivering a check. The king moves to d8, and then the king ultimately takes the knight. Black is going to make a mistake. They are going to use the c7 square with their queen when it was actually the black king who needed to try to get to c7. The right move would have been to play queen to b4 check, forcing the king to go to a8, then king to c7. We're threatening queen to b8 mate. But as I told you, in the game, black used the c7 square, not with their king, but with their queen. They play queen to c7, and you can understand why. Queen to c7 check, king to a8, and rook to a5. And now you think, for white, it's hopeless. We're threatening queen takes knight mate. Rook takes knight mate, even queen to c8 mate, since the knight is pinned. There are 3 possible checkmates, and yet white is going to get out of it. So what are they going to play? Well, the knight on a7 is pinned, both rooks and the bishop can't move, but you can play bishop to g5 check. To deflect the black rook, give the white king some breathing room, avoid mates, and above all, bring both rooks into action against the black king. While the white king was in grave danger of being checkmated, the situation is now reversed, and it's the black king who risks being mated. For example, if black doesn't want to take the bishop, doesn't want to move their rook, and plays king to e8, well, we play rook to e1 check. And if black still doesn't want to play rook to e5 to avoid moving their rook, they'll play king to f8, but then rook to f1 check. And after king to g8, it's white who checkmates with rook to e8. Checkmate, whereas earlier both rooks and the bishop weren't even in play. So we understand that after this bishop to g5 check, black is actually forced to take the bishop. But now it's the rook's counterattack. Rook to d1 check. The knight controls the c8 square, so king to e8. Rook to e1 check. The king moves to f8. Rook to d7. We're attacking the queen with this incredible collaboration. The knight protects the pawn protects the rook, the knight controls the c8 square, the rook controls the d8 square, and the black queen is unable to threaten the white king. So queen takes h2, rook to e7. Both rooks are on the 7th rank. The pawn now threatens to promote to a queen. This turnaround is just incredible. But who's going to win this game? Because now black plays queen takes g2. They pin the c6 pawn. Rook to b7 to unpin the c6 pawn. The rook steps in on the diagonal. Rook to c5 is played. Pawn to c7. Black can't take the rook on e7 because the pawn could advance, promote to a queen, and free the rook to give check. So the black queen moves to g4 to control the c8 square with the help of the rook. White plays rook to f7 check. Still no question of taking the rook because of that pawn that could advance and free the rook. So the king goes back to e8. And now who would have thought? The position will be decided by the involvement of the a, d, b, d pawns and the g7, h7 pawns. b4 is played to try to destabilize the rook's control over the c8 square. Rook to c2. A 4 is played. Pawn to h5, a 5, pawn to h4, b5, pawn to h3, knight to c6, pawn to h2. The black side thinks, after all, the queen still controls the c8 square. And now the move by white that will force black to resign. What is this move? Well, I invite you one last time to look for the winning move. What did you think of? Well, in this position, the winning move is rook takes g7. With the idea that the black queen cannot capture the rook, otherwise she abandons control of the c8 square and white could play c8, promote to queen, and deliver checkmate. So the queen, for example, will move to h3, still to control the c8 square, but now white can play rook to b8. Because what was saving black when the rook was on f7 was that the king could capture that rook on f7. But now he can't, so rook to c8 leads to checkmate. The queen will have to come to c8 and then rook takes checkmate. That's how the game ends. With a truly incredible, absolutely wild match, checkmates everywhere, very surprising moves, and a completely unpredictable outcome. I hope you enjoyed following this amazing game as much as I did, played in 1983, at a time when computers were nowhere near as powerful as they are today. Of course, there were mistakes on both sides in this game, but it was a very lively, very surprising match. So if you enjoyed it, you can leave me likes, comments. Of course, I read them all. You can support the channel, and we'll see each other soon for a new video. Goodbye, everyone.